Good. So I think it is time to get started. So welcome to our March Web Debate. As you know, the Web Debates are organized by DiploFoundation in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. What we do is we meet once a month to discuss key questions in diplomacy and diplomatic practice. And this month we have a very important question. We are asking, how can African states navigate multilateral diplomacy successfully? So for example, if we look at key venues of multilateral diplomacy, such as the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council, for example, what are strategies for African states to engage successfully in these venues? Similarly, what are obstacles? What are potential responses? And I guess importantly also, what are future directions for African diplomacy? And here I think some of the related questions we might also ask are, to what extent is African diplomacy informed by the common experience of colonialism? Similarly, with no permanent representation on the UN Security Council, how can key concerns be addressed? To what extent is it useful to work through the African Union and groups such as the Group of 77 or the Non-Aligned Movement? And last but not least, what is the importance of regional groupings and organizations such as the Economic Community of West African States and the South African Development Community? There are lots of questions here, and all of them are really important and formidable. And to address these formidable questions, we have two distinguished and excellent speakers with us, and I'm extremely happy to have both of us here. We have Ambassador Amre Al-Giowaili, and we have Dr. Yolanda Kemp-Spies. Before I hand over to Yolanda for her brief introduction, I'd like to give you a little bit of background to both of them. Ambassador Amre Al-Giowaili is Egypt's ambassador to Serbia. He has held leading positions in multilateral negotiations, including Rapporteur of the United Nations Special Committee on Peacekeeping in 2015, Coordinator for Peacekeeping of the African Group of Experts in New York in 2015, and Coordinator for Disarmament of the Arab Group of Experts in New York from 2011 to 2015. His previous diplomatic postings were New York, Geneva, and Washington, D.C. At the Foreign Ministry, he served as Deputy Assistant Foreign Minister for United Nations Affairs and Director of UN Affairs. And Dr. Yolanda Kemp-Spies is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Johannesburg, Chair in African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. She was a diplomat for 18 years before she joined academia in order to specialize in diplomatic studies. She has designed and presented diplomatic training programs to South African as well as other groups of diplomats. She received her own diplomatic training at the Department of Foreign Affairs in South Africa and Oxford University. Before I hand over to both of them for their brief introductions, I would like to remind you that the debate is very much driven by the questions and comments of the audience. So please do not hold back and share your questions and comments with us in the chat. I will look at the questions and will relate the questions back to our two distinguished speakers. But for now, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor first to Yolanda and then to Amre. So if you would like to get us started, please, Yolanda.
Sunny Pretoria. Our discussion today on multilateralism and Africa is very apt because it is interwoven with the identity of Africa. Sitting here with the Egyptian ambassador, I'm reminded that Egypt and South Africa were two of only 4 founding members of the United Nations. And that indicates exactly what the state was of African political sovereignty in 1945. That is not very long ago. Today, Africa has 54 members of the United Nations, and we are the largest regional bloc in that organization. Now, the world reached its apex in terms of multilateral organization when the United Nations was founded. And as mentioned, Africa only then started its political journey towards full political sovereignty. So Africa has marched with the world in this new multilateral emphasis in the global diplomatic arena. But for Africa, multilateralism has much deeper significance. You are all aware of the fact that Africa was arbitrarily divided under colonial rule, and therefore the political borders do not indicate ethnic or other affiliation. And state building was therefore a much more difficult project in Africa than it was elsewhere in the world, because artificial states had to be consolidated. And because of the historical divisions, Africans have had almost an obsession with unity and with integration of the continent, sometimes to a fault, because it precluded some other more rational multilateral decisions. But it can be understood in an historical context. So Africa has, throughout its journey, and especially starting in the 1960s, tended to form blocs within international organizations such as the United Nations. And when you read through the index of resolutions taken by the United Nations, you will note a history of Africa's political grievances and concerns in the international society. It's interesting that individual countries have also elected, and increasingly so over recent years, to engage Africa as a whole. So you have a China-Africa Forum, Japan has done the same, Turkey has done the same, Korea. There is this inclination to treat Africa as though it is a whole continent with single unitary interests. It's not, of course, and Africa has very serious divisions in terms of its unity project. And I want to skip over the history because of limited time and just concentrate perhaps on a few ideas on Africa's multilateral project taking us forward. The first one is that Africa needs to become much more clinical and strategic in its multilateral projects. In that sense, it needs to be more flexible in moving into multilateral formations that are more minilateral. Some people use the word plurilateral within international forums, so that sometimes a critical mass of African states, 3 or 4 or 5, could be sufficient to drive an agenda without necessarily wanting to invoke total continental consensus. Another multilateral strategy is to indeed be so flexible that you also reach out to the non-state actors in a new form of diplomacy called polylateral diplomacy. There are very interesting initiatives, and some of them have reaped rewards at the multilateral level, where state and non-state actors join forces. Something else is that Africans, and I'm a passionate African, so when I say this with a lot of appreciation of the capacity constraints that we face. Africans must do their homework before they enter into negotiations and into multilateral treaties. They need to read the fine print in legal deals, in treaties, for example, to prevent them from suffering from buyer's remorse. And the ambassador will know that we are so under-resourced that we come up against teams of negotiators from other countries that have massive preparatory homework done. But for that reason, Africa needs to make the most of its own resources. And that means that we need to team up with each other. When we have expertise residing in different countries, we need to reach out and also draw on that expertise. Same with training of diplomats. We are vastly undertrained on the continent. South Africa and Egypt are some of the exceptions that have institutionalized diplomatic training, and we need to train our neighbors. We need to ensure that organizations such as the African Union actually take care of diplomatic training of their members. Also to connect into international networks and resources. I'm thinking of your own DiploFoundation that offers incredible online training with a developmental focus. We need to make much more use of that. And then finally, perhaps a word on multilateral strategy. We should not be naive about the world and emerging powers. The fact that other countries are also developing does not mean that they necessarily have Africa's best interests at heart. And we have a new scramble for Africa. We have new emerging powers moving into Africa. And as a continent, we must be very, very open-minded, but also very realistic about the agendas that are now also coming to Africa. I think on that note, I'll leave it to the ambassador so that we can engage in questions and debate.
Dr. Spies, these are a comprehensive introduction, which makes my job both easier and more difficult. Easier because you've covered all the essentials, but more difficult is to think of new additions. But let me first express my thanks to our co-lecturer, Dr. Kat Hoon, whom I am very happy to share with her in lecturing the course on multilateral diplomacy, structure and process, and a course to which I invite, of course, all our listeners to have a look at and hopefully join. Very happy to join you, Dr. Spies. We always speak of the Cairo-Cape Town road, so this is very much an implementation of that, and of course in the benefit and the share of our African continent, but also very happy to be at the Diplo Belgrade office. And since we're trying always to convince Diplo to conduct more activities in Belgrade, and they know I'm technologically challenged, so they told me, come here, it's safer to speak from here. So very happy to be in Belgrade and the Diplo office especially. I think that the title of this session and this web debate is very pertinent, because first almost the choice of that particular title is how can we navigate multilateral diplomacy. So multilateral diplomacy is almost like a vast ocean or a vast sea where it has different dimensions and different, I would say even different geometries. And Dr. Spies, you spoke yourself about the concept of minilateralism and multilateralism and how these are variable geometry of multilateral fora. So these are almost, it's a wide sea, it's a wide ocean, with a few routes to navigate, and there are obviously easier currents to join and in order to reach safe shores, should I say. So it's important that we actually recognize that multilateral diplomacy has this variable geometry. Probably our discussion will focus more on the United Nations, it being the only universal organization with a comprehensive mandate. But equally so, we should also be aware that this multilateral ocean or multilateral sea has different manifestations. Some some in more institutional formats, such as the UN and its specialized agencies and even regional organizations, but also some that are much less identifiable in terms of parameter, in terms of rules, in terms of ways to navigate, if we use the title, and that is where it is more even challenging for African countries. Dr. Spies mentioned that only 2 of the current African countries or so were founders of the United Nations. Well, even fewer of us, of these national or these African countries, are actually founding of these new, less formal, yet very influential fora, such as, for example, the World Economic Forum. Is that a multilateral forum or not? Such as the G20 and so on and so forth. So that even adds a layer of complexity that makes it more important to recognize and also sometimes more difficult to navigate. But some of the more established, let me start, I know Dr. Hoon, Kat, you asked us to focus on strategies and obstacles. Let me try to identify a few obstacles, and then we see some possible options for strategies to overcome them. So if we only speak about the UN, it being the very you know, as we said, the only universal organization with a comprehensive mandate, because we have some universal organizations that don't have a comprehensive mandate. These are the specialized agencies and other. And if we look at the headquarters of the UN, we'll find that all the headquarters of the United Nations are in the north and not in the south, which means, as a starting point, that Africa is not, it being in the south or being part of the global south is by definition non-present in terms of venue and headquarter of these organizations. In fact, there is only, I hear now, only one international organization, which is not even a UN multilateral fora, IRENA, the Organization for a Renewable Agency, which is not situated in the north, let alone the three headquarters of the UN are all in either European or North American soil. So by definition, in terms of geographical location, Africa and the global south in general is excluded from the advantage and the privilege and the contribution of hosting headquarters of the UN. But also, when we come to challenges, we identify the aspect of complexity. That many of the subjects being discussed within the international relations in a globalized world are becoming more and more technical and hence more and more specialized. Diplo has actually offered a unique perspective in bridging the gap between the traditional diplomatic culture and these new fields by merging more or less the ICT community with the diplomatic community, particularly as the world embarked on the World Summit on Information Society in Geneva in Tunis 2003-2005. But still, the subjects in general are very, very specialized, and hence they demand a unique blend of diplomatic experience with specialized and technical knowledge in terms of the substance area. Also, in terms of the players and the actors, there is an increasingly complex dimension, or dimension added to complexity, which is the emergence of the so-called multi-stakeholder diplomacy, whereby governments and states are not the only actors and participants in multilateral fora, but increasingly so, of course, the civil society, and increasingly so the private sector and other forms of actors. As important as this is to open the international relations and multilateral diplomacy to actors which are not traditional, as challenging as it is for African countries and developing countries in general, in order for these countries to have a genuine grassroots representation defending their points of view and promoting their interests. But even in the form of negotiation itself, the negotiations are becoming more complex in the sense that there are more parallel meetings, there are more there are more layers of and structure of negotiations, which, as Dr. Spies mentioned, puts an increased pressure or burden on countries that have more limited financial and human resources to participate. So even when it looks like, okay, fine, we have an open set of meetings and it's open for everyone, but if it's parallel, it means that it's not open for everyone, because by definition, if it's a small delegation, one can only attend a select few, while larger delegations, particularly those delegations which actually host the venues or the headquarters of the UN, can have this incredible privilege of sending as many experts as they could. So what are the strategies that can help to overcome those main obstacles? Probably the first strategy is to recognize that that Africa has a unique platform, which is the African Union. As you know, the UN has 5 regional groups. African group is one of those 5. But what really makes it different for the African group is that most of the other groups are only electoral groups, what we call electoral groups. They are not also negotiating groups, or they're not also groups which have common positions on multilateral fora. The African group has this incredible advantage of it being an electoral group, like all the other, like the 5, but also an electoral group that increasingly has common stands through the negotiations that takes place within the seats of the EU and elsewhere, and that is a dimension and a strategy that is yet to be fully utilized. In fact, it provides a very good base, but it has a huge potential. So the linkage between Addis Ababa and New York, or Addis Ababa Vienna, or Addis Ababa Geneva, is one that provides very good food for thought in terms of a strategy. The other probably issue that or strategy that I would like to highlight, maybe before we go into the question and answer session, is that the title of this web debate is "How can African states navigate?" Now, it's very important to recognize that also African states are part of a larger whole. And in this case, they're part of developing countries. And developing countries have two very well-established negotiating groups in multilateral fora, particularly in the UN, which are the G77 and the non-aligned movement. It may seem to some that the epoch or the era for these two platforms has gone. I would probably think it's the other way around, that there is more need for these two platforms, for these two forums, the non-aligned and the G77, to defend the basic principles of multilateralism, which is open, transparent, democratic decision-making. And I'm very happy to share, of course, as you know, that Egypt currently chairs the G77 in New York, and hence, at a time that is very, very critical for the UN, we have three parallel reform processes: the administrative reform process, the development system or the reform process, and the peace and security reform process. So through the G77, in this very important year of 2018, we can air out some of the priorities of developing countries and African countries among them as well. So a few obstacles, but also a number of options and strategies available for us to overcome. Back to you, Kat.
Thank you both for this excellent introduction. Very broad, a very, very good starting point. And what I found really interesting was to note the commonalities in what both of you were talking about. Issues of complexity, issues of lack of capacity, and what can be done. We also heard a couple of possible strategies already. And from there, I think there are a couple of questions already from the audience that really speak to this. So first of all, I would like to maybe hear more about the potential of building those capacities on the one hand, or of the creative ways of bridging capacity gaps, or simply bridging resource gaps and gaps in the availability of negotiators, of people on the ground, because we heard there are these massive inequalities. So what can be done, maybe what is already underway, what can be done, and maybe what are creative solutions in this regard. From our participants online, there are a couple of very interesting comments. I'd like to start with two questions. There are lots of questions, but I'd like to start with two. First is a question and a comment. It is Africa is very absent from digital policy processes, and this is something that the ambassador mentioned. It is probably more absent in digital policy processes than it is in trade, climate change, and humanitarian negotiations. What can be done? And then the other question, and this refers more to African states amongst each other, what do you see the impact of conflicts in Africa is the question. Do you think we need a new strategy for preventive diplomacy in African countries? So kind of also looking inward, because what I noticed is in Yolanda's introduction, there were some comments about questions of unity and questions of the relation of African countries towards each other. So I think this is a good starting point. If I may give the floor to Yolanda, and then maybe Amge adding a couple of additional points from your perspective, and especially from your perspective experience in New York, for example, which will be very interesting to a lot of people.
Katerina, I think I'll say a few things about conflict in Africa. It is a matter that is of grave concern to Africans because it has a direct influence on our developmental status and our achievement of universal goals in terms of human quality of human life. It also brings into play the power diplomacy nexus in forums like the United Nations Security Council, which is dominated, unfortunately, dominated by African issues, but at the same time is structurally indicative of an era that's long past. The 5 permanent members were the victor states of the Second World War. Africa has no permanent representation there. So the forum where the world's peace and security is authoritatively deliberated on sees a permanent absence of African representation. Africa itself, through the African Union, has placed much more emphasis on development of the African peace and security architecture. The predecessor of the AU, the Organization of African Unity, placed most emphasis on creating integration and unity. And at this stage, the continent is very seriously working on addressing its own problems, because addressing peace and security in Africa leaves opportunity for foreign involvement that sometimes comes at a great cost. And an example here is the intervention that was done in Libya in 2011, and the world seemed to have consensus that an intervention was required. But the way it was handled, leading to a regime change, and the fact that it was headed by NATO rather than the African Union or even the Arab League, created long-term political problems. So peace and security lends itself exceptionally to multilateralism. There is no other way we can address these issues. In Africa, most of the conflicts start as intrastate conflicts, then spill over borders, and eventually become a regional or even a continental problem. So it's the raison d'etre for many of our multilateral initiatives. And once again, Africans need to be aware that the entire world has an interest in seeing peace and security in Africa, but that we must be careful in the extent to which we allow the rest of the world, including former colonial powers like France, which has several military bases in Africa, to dictate to Africans how to solve peace and security.
Yes, sure. So thank you, Kat, for these two particular issues that you highlighted, and particularly on capacity building, the first point that you raised. Well, the efforts that are conducted, for example, by Diplo, are one complete example of how to enable diplomats and other actors of diplomacy raise their capacities with regards to negotiations. And here I would like to actually mention a concept that participation is not enough. So when we speak about the need for a true multilateral or genuine multilateral platform for negotiation, the fact that it is open for negotiation by all actors, that in itself is not enough. What is needed is actually what we had termed once in one workshop in El Alamein in Egypt, is what we call an enabling multilateralism. When we speak about investment fora, usually multinationals they say we need an enabling environment, internal, domestic, economic enabling environment. That is exactly the type of environment that we would need at the multilateral fora, that it is an enabling multilateralism, not just by simple participation, but also by having the rules of the game, the dynamics of negotiations, enabling for developing countries to project their views and defend their interests. But equally so in terms of capacity building, it's very, very important to enable and to develop the intellectual capacities of African countries in terms of presenting or shaping the discourse, meaning that it's not only the participation in the negotiations, but rather it is the discourse, the talking points, the proposals that are to be presented on the table. And here, multilateral diplomats from developed countries have the incredible advantage of having a huge network of research centers and think tanks in universities supporting them with relevant research and evidence-based studies and other form of academic contribution. So I think probably enabling grassroots, genuine research centers and think tanks such as the one I'm sure Dr. Spies contributes to is now become an important pillar in helping the negotiators from developing countries. Also, one way of raising the capacity is actually to learn from past experiences. So I think that just a record of the accumulated experience of leading African negotiators and leading developing countries negotiations would be a huge contribution to the current generation of diplomats and multilateral negotiators by actually learning from the experiences of the former generations. And in this case, I think also Diplo has a lot to share through its set of publications. On the other issue related to conflicts, Dr. Spies referred to APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture, which, by the way, I would think is a much more developed architecture than, first of all, elsewhere in other regions, but even compared to the UN. Why? Have we ever heard of the term UN Peace and Security Architecture? And probably the answer is not necessarily so, because we think of each component of the peace and security architecture of the UN separately. So for peacekeeping, you have that form of mechanism. For peace building, you have that form of mechanisms or fora, and then for peacemaking, you have a third. While in the African front, it was one of its most valuable additions and contributions is that it looks at peace and security holistically. It has the prevention pillar, it has the management pillar, and it has the sustaining peace pillar, although that in particular there is more that we can develop on the African front. So I would share with you that in 2011, for example, the African Union Summit adopted a decision to establish an African Union post-conflict reconstruction and development center, basically the peace-building arm of what would be of a comprehensive peace and security architecture. So that particular arm, if it is so developed, will be a major and valuable addition to conflict resolution and conflict management within the African Union dimension. Also enhancing the relations between the UN and the African Union through the Peace and Security Council at the AU side and the UN Security Council on the UN side and the regular meetings that they hold is probably also an essential avenue of cooperation between the two organizations, and it falls within Chapter 8 in general. So yes, there is much to be done on that front, but also there is much that has been achieved that we can celebrate.
I think it's really important to highlight also what has been accomplished and the kind of progress that has been made instead of only focusing on the obstacles. There are lots of questions that are coming in, which is absolutely great to see. There's one question that takes us, it's for Yolanda, and it takes us back to her introductory remarks. And it is just a question of clarification about foreign actors and foreign countries coming into Africa, and this is probably about resources and working with African governments, and how this can be managed in a productive way, how this can be addressed, because it is very much a reality that Africa as a continent has been facing for quite a while. The other comment brings us very much back to some of the points that Amr just made, and it is again on the African Union. And here the comment is the African Union is a great organization, but it is also a reality that its functionality is very much limited to its ability to enforce decisions. The report of President Kagame, says the participant from the blog, the report of President Kagame on the functionality of Africa is quite revealing in this regard. First of all, my question for maybe both of you, if you want to address this, do you agree? And then, what is exactly the potential of working with the African Union, and what are the obstacles and strategies to work with these obstacles in this regard?
Katerina, shall I start? Katerina, I want to reply, but more implicitly, to one of the criticisms that was raised in that same question, and this is the quality of African sovereignty and of African political life. It is true that we've battled with elite-dominated societies where civil society in many African countries remains weak. In some, it's vibrant, but that's definitely a problem that needs to be addressed in most of Africa. We need much more buy-in from a general population in the decisions and in the movements that we are, as diplomats, that we are driving. It is unfortunate that much of the vision that we expect from leadership has also become conflated with personal agendas of leaders, whereby third-termism, as it's called, is just a different form of really staging coup d'etats in Africa. Leaders that do not lead, but just basically hog power. And for too long have many of these leaders been excused by their peers. It's interesting that we also have a unique system in Africa, and it is working, but it's not continentally working yet, and it's called the African Peer Review mechanism, whereby countries voluntarily allow themselves to be assessed by their peers in the continent, and deficiencies and weaknesses are identified where those countries then work on. It's a wonderful but under-recognized mechanism, and I hope that in future we are going to see this becoming the norm in Africa rather than the exception. Just quickly want to make some comment on the question about the new actors in Africa. I do not want to be paranoid about any foreign actors in Africa, neither do I want to encourage anybody vilifying any specific states that operate in Africa. What I'm saying is that we need to be realistic. They come here because there are interests for them here. And for that reason, it is naive to just harp on our colonial legacy when there are many states who were not previously involved now clamoring for space in Africa. So without necessarily saying this or that state has a particularly obnoxious agenda, I'm just appealing to Africans to understand that the world out there is interested in Africa, and not just because we have wonderful natural resources. Our population is the youth of the world. So Europe, for example, knows that its demographics are changing, and Africa is playing a role in that. We must understand how important we are to the world and operate around that strategically, without being naive or thinking just because countries share our global self-possession that they are necessarily more benign than any of the previous dragons in our story.
Much, Amre, what is it that you would like to add from your experience on these questions of AU and building?
Yes, you first raised the issue about the, intervention, and now there is more and more talk about enhancing or operationalizing the preventive diplomacy by the UN and by other multilateral fora. And here I'd like to say, no one, of course, would. I always said that. I said it even in a UN General Assembly debate. Would anyone disagree if his or her doctor or physician asked them to take more preventive methods in order not to get sick? And the answer would be, of course, be no. But why are some countries wary of this notion of preventive diplomacy? Because it can actually, in the eyes of some, mean intervention. So we really need to differentiate between prevention and between intervention. And in fact, most conflicts in the world now, I would argue, are caused because of intervention by external actors and actors that are beyond the national borders of this particular conflict where it is, rather than the lack of that intervention. So yes, we should enhance the preventive diplomacy pillar of the UN and other multilateral fora, but we should not also open the appetite or use that as an entry door for more intervention in what otherwise would be very well or better managed through the direct actors themselves. And that delicate balance and that thin line between both is something that I think we need to be aware of conceptually. On the AU functionality and enforcing decisions, now of course all multilateral fora face that challenge of the enforcement of their own decision and the functionality of their own mechanism. But I think, and probably without any form of bias for the African Union, where I participated in a large number of meetings, if you compare the AU to other regional organizations and Chapter 8 institutions, you would see that it has a relatively good record of follow-up to its, or actually of promoting its decisions and follow up to them, and especially that now we have a more equipped headquarter of the Union in Addis Ababa, and we have more elaborate mechanisms of coordination in this regard as well. But this is a challenge that faces all multilateral diplomacy fora, not only those within the region of Africa.
Thank you. I think this is extremely important to keep in mind. We're coming to a very interesting topic, which is UN reform. So, especially in this context, there are quite severe constraints if you look at the Security Council that African countries face in terms of representation. So one of the questions that came up from our participants is, how can African countries push for UN reform, or how can they somehow play around or overcome such constraints? And it obviously reminds us of pushes for UN reform that seem to repeat themselves in certain intervals over decades. It reminds us of the Slovenia consensus and previous attempts for UN Security Council reform. And I think it is a topic that we rightfully keep coming back to over and over again. So what is your assessment on this situation and on potentials for UN reform and, well, African countries, if I may generalize so much, to work towards better representation or a better way of making their voices and concerns heard within UN bodies and, of course, specifically the UN Security Council? Yolanda, if you would like to start. I think it's a really important question.
Africa is the only regional group, the only continent that has a unified or allegedly unified position regarding UN Security Council reform. And as you mentioned, it's the Eswatini consensus of 2005. I'm not very positive about the Eswatini consensus because, in the first place, it was never a consensus. It was a majority decision that was taken by the African Union in Zicht of that year. I think it should be revisited. I love the idea that we have a common position, except that it is not common, and I think it is too extreme. It insists on 2 permanent seats with full veto powers and additional non-permanent seats. I think we need to be more flexible. We need to align our position with other groups that are also pushing for Security Council reform and which really want Africa to be represented there. That's the one thing. But in practice, several countries, including South Africa and Nigeria, have basically gone the road alone. They have both Egypt also presented themselves as ready, able, and willing to take up a permanent seat, and they just don't refer to the Eswatini consensus. I think we should revisit it as a continent. Having said that, the debate on UN Security Council reform is so tough. It is so difficult because you have, in terms of international law, you have the very focus of concern, namely the permanent five with veto powers and the size entrenched in international law. And the only way to change that is to have the permanent five actually agree to such change. So what you find in practice is that increasingly peace and security is addressed not just within the Security Council but around the Security Council. It is increasingly impossible for the Security Council to do an intervention if it does not have the buy-in of the regional organization in that part of the world. Now, the 2011 intervention in Libya was a fluke because at that stage the African Union did not oppose the intervention through its 3 members who were on the council that year, but it had not yet formed its own coherent approach to the problem, and that hesitation left opportunity for an international intervention that was also led by NATO. But we see with the current deadlock about any action in Syria that the United Nations Security Council is only as strong as its regional components, whether it is thus in the theory of international law, it is true de facto in the diplomacy of the 21st century.
You know how debatable this topic is, Kat, and let me very positively offer a different perspective from my good friend and my good colleague, Dr. Yolanda Spies here. Now, yes, she said Africa is unique among all the other continents, actually regional groups, that it has a common position. But not only that, it is also unique that it has this common position, is a really consensus and shared declaration, which is adopted at the highest level, which is heads of states and governments. And the third aspect of uniqueness is that it has a common position, adopted at the highest level, and regularly reiterated almost at every summit and assembly of heads of states of the African Union. So this is a really unique base compared to any other regional group that may be interested in this particular negotiation. Whether this, now, any group, African or not, that has those 3 pillars, common, heads of states, and regularly reiterated, would it be, you know, is there need for it to forego any of those 3 pillars or that strong base if the other parties have not, negotiating parties have not presented any new approach from their side? And I would think that the logical answer would be there would not be need to do so. In fact, it would not be wise to do so. So we have to look at the negotiations for the Security Council reform from the wider perspective, from a bird's eye. Let's look at all the players and see whether those other players have presented new proposals compared to the original ones. And I would think I've been following this issue for quite a few years, almost 12 years now, and I have not seen any fundamental change in the proposals by other negotiating parties, which in this sense makes it even more imperative for Africa to continue to promote that position, especially, and I would think that this is numerically proven, that it is gaining more support in the public discourse of other countries than it used to be before. It is gaining more support from other countries outside of the African continent. But I know there are different, advice and different consultations in this regard, and it's very useful to hear that diversity of view. Let me add one last point in this regard. Security Council reform is by definition United Nations reform, which means that there are other aspects and avenues and dimensions of reforming the UN that are also part and parcel of making this organization more effective and more democratic and more impactful. And hence, we should always also get the bigger picture of revitalization of the General Assembly, which is one issue and topic where the African group and the G77 and NAM have been quite active, but also reforming the peace and security architecture, which is now being discussed, and so on and so forth. So yes, it is an important pillar within a larger picture that that I think would be wise to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think both of these comments add a very useful perspective on questions of Security Council reform. We're drawing to a close of the debate. So I would like to bring our discussion back to one very concrete question, which is back to capacity building. And here, maybe just to pick your brains on questions of what is your advice to foreign ministries or regional groupings or the African Union in regard to capacity building that would really support the diplomacy of individual African states or the diplomacy of Africa, maybe through the EU or other regional groupings as a whole? What is your wish with regard to capacity building for the future? That would be very interesting, and I think that would also be a good way of rounding up the debate and drawing to a close. So I'm really curious to hear what you would suggest and what you would hope for. Let's start with Yolanda again, please.
Yes, as somebody who has a background in diplomacy and in diplomatic training, I want to see diplomatic training centers in every country and competing with the best out there. That's not entirely realistic at this stage, and therefore my first proposal would be to have significant regional diplomatic academies, perhaps situated in the various regional economic communities of Africa. Also for the African Union to coordinate this and to ensure that sufficient funding and resources are channeled. I don't think diplomatic training, capacity building is always sufficiently prioritized by governments. Diplomats, in some people's estimation, are just good people who are recruited and then deployed. But there is so much to be invested in the foot soldiers of our diplomacy that we deploy around the world. We need so many more of them, and we need them to feel confident in their economic diplomacy skills, in their multilateral diplomatic negotiation skills. So that's my plea for the continent to become very serious about diplomatic training and to allocate resources. Just a final point on that also, many African countries are beneficiaries of foreign training, and once again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are, of course, advantages to that, but if you are only trained by a foreign entity, invariably you become inducted into that diplomatic culture, and you end up representing the other entity rather than your own. So it should be a secondary resource for Africa to resort to foreign training, and primarily we should do it for ourselves.
I can echo what Dr. Spies has just mentioned. They're all high priority and very relevant issues in raising capacity building within the African countries and developing countries in general. But let me just add, I think we have, as African countries, achieved a remarkable progress in terms of human resources, particularly related to diplomats. What we probably lack in terms of negotiating skills, in terms of representation, in terms of knowledge of the intergovernmental machinery of the UN or other multilateral fora, but what we currently lack is talking points, which basically mean material and intellectual support for the positions that we project. So I would say we need a unity of message, even if there's a multiplicity of messengers. You know, we're all messengers in terms of diplomats representing African countries. But if we speak with the same discourse, with the same material, that will be the real value added. So I would say, if we're talking about capacity building, one form of indirect capacity building would be upgrading policy research. As important as academic studies are, as important as also it is to bridge those academic studies to the level of what we call policy research that is supportive of diplomatic and foreign policy machinery. And the more this is genuinely anchored or reflective of developing country position, the more this is this is relevant. You know, I'll give you an anecdote. I say, you know, I was once debating with one representative of a multilateral institution, and he was telling me, "Why are you complaining of lack of representation and lack of participants and all that?" I can tell you that this particular institution, and it was not in New York and neither in Geneva, but this particular institution has 100 nationalities represented in the Secretariat. And he thought that this is the answer. I couldn't, you know, think that this is so convincing. And I told him, so Mr. Representative of Secretariat of this organization, those 100 participants, they're graduates of how many universities? And it was almost 10 universities. So yes, there are 100 nationalities, but only 10 perspectives represented in that particular Secretariat. But we need 100 nationalities, but also 100 universities, 100 countries from the South being represented there. And if that is achieved, the capacity building dimension of it will be simply remarkable in my point of view.
Thank you both. I'll take these as final comments. But what I was amazed by was the 1 hour we had and the kind of debate, the debate we had and the questions we raised is that although it's an extremely broad topic, we set ourselves for this web debate. In between, there were very concrete suggestions, almost like a bullet point list of things to keep in mind, of things to address in the future, as just evident in this discussion on capacity building. For example, more resources, more strategic planning, bottom-up approaches. I think very useful and also very concrete. And I think with such a broad topic, this obviously can only be a starting point. But for that starting point of a debate, I think we have done extremely well. And I should say our two speakers, Yolanda and Amer, you have done extremely well. And it was an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I'm extremely grateful that you agreed to join us today, because this was not only useful, I think this also looks towards the future and towards making appreciating what has been accomplished, but also towards making key changes that will lead to better, more productive, and more integrated diplomacy. So thank you. This was absolutely incisive and interesting, and also passionate, which is very important, I think, for any topic. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our audience who had very probing, very interesting questions and comments. It was an absolute pleasure to see that as well. So thank you for that. I'd like to finish by saying we will meet again next month in April with a new topic and a completely different topic, where we will look at mediation and how mediation can be supported by digital means in the context of cyber mediation. A very different topic. But having said this, there were so many important things we raised today, so we will follow up with a summary, and we will make sure to follow up in our work at DiploFoundation by keeping these things in mind and by doing the best we can and to support capacity building, especially in an African country. So thank you, Yolanda.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Again, it was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, and see you on the multilateral course.
Bye. Thank you. Yes, the course which will start, I think, in July. And I'm sure we will bring some of the perspectives we just discussed in even more now. I think it's. I
want to go and have coffee with Ambassador Amre in Eswatini.